Welcome and thank you for joining us today on our presentation on updated guidelines for planning in bushfire-prone areas version 1.4. We would like to acknowledge the Aboriginal people of Western Australia as the traditional custodians of this land, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. We acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people as whose land we're recording from today. The Land Use Planning Policy team writes and reviews planning policy for the state, and today we will present on the latest update to the guidelines for planning in bushfire-prone areas, which was released in December 2021 and is now version 1.4. There will be further review of the guidelines and the State Planning Policy 3.7 through the Bushfire Framework Review, which is in progress at the moment. Today we will talk through the following sections and elements of the updated guidelines. These are Summary of Changes from version 1.3, Section 2.6 Discretionary Decision Making, Section 2.7 Legacy Approvals, Element 2 Asset Protection Zones, Schedule 1 and Explanatory Notes, Element 3 Vehicular Access, Element 4 Water, Element 5 Vulnerable Tourism Land Uses, and application of version 1.4. We have incorporated more into this version than what was originally proposed to acknowledge implementation issues and the delay in the overall bushfire framework review. This revision provides an interim version until the full revision that includes a response to the new map of bushfire-prone areas is released later in 2022. The main changes to this version are that we have three new sections: 2.6 Discretionary Decision Making, 2.7 Legacy, and Element 5 Vulnerable Tourism Land Uses, an update to the Vulnerable Land Uses Preamble, and significant revision of bushfire protection criteria. Section 2.6 is a new section, but essentially it carries across existing information from Planning Bulletin 111-2016. The bulletin has been incorporated into the guidelines for ease of reference, and this means that it will be rescinded from the 13th of March 2022. Only Section 5 exemptions from the bulletin have been included and not the entirety of the information in the bulletin. This is because the remainder of the bulletin was included for guidance when the SPP guidelines and bushfire planning regulations were first introduced and are now considered common knowledge. Section 2.6 allows for applications to be considered exempt from the requirements of SPP 3.7. If not, they are not considered as increasing the bushfire threat and/or not considered an intensification of land use or development, in line with Point A and Point B on this slide. Legacy sites are those sites that are unable to comply with the bushfire protection criteria but have a planning approval that was granted prior to the introduction of the SPP and guidelines in 2015. For example, zoning or an approved structure plan. Should a decision maker wish to make a discretionary decision, this section provides guidance for what they should consider. The onus is on the proponent, and that is because an application is a legacy approval. They will not be automatically supported despite being non-compliant. An application should always demonstrate compliance with the bushfire protection criteria in the first instance. However, we recognise that in some instances, a legacy site which was approved prior to SPP 3.7 coming to effect may make it difficult for a current application to achieve compliance with SPP 3.7, such as the applicant being unable to redesign the proposal, and there is merit in applying discretion and approving the application despite the non-compliance. On the right side of the slide, it lists considerations that the BMP should include, and these bushfire mitigation measures are provided in the guidelines, along with examples of what may be considered as a legacy site. Element 2, Siting and Design of Development, aims to provide guidance on the location of development within a lot using a site-specific focus. The acceptable solutions for Element 2 have remained the same and will be revised in version 2 of the guidelines. Schedule 1 outlines the standards to which landowners should maintain their Asset Protection Zone, or APZ. Minor updates to Schedule 1 have been made to provide additional guidance for the types of objects and fine fuel load that are permitted within an APZ. This includes further guidance on the mulch allowed and the location of gas cylinders. Defendable space was previously mentioned in the explanatory notes, and this now sits within Schedule 1. We've aligned tree and scrub heights with the 2018 version of Australian Standard 3959 Construction of Buildings in Bushfire-Prone Areas. It was previously 5 metres and is now 6 metres before a category change occurs to what is classed as tree. For each of the vegetation categories, the asterisk has been included to make reference to considering selection of plants based on their plant flammability as explained in the explanatory notes. Element 2 explanatory notes have been significantly expanded to provide guidance on how to manage an APZ and balance it alongside environmental considerations, how to site habitable buildings to minimise clearing, estimating fuel load, landscaping, design and maintenance within an APZ, plant selection within an APZ based on plant flammability. The proposed changes aim to align best practice of managing an APZ. Appropriate design will greatly assist with bushfire prevention and suppression operations. Hazard separation should be considered and integrated during initial planning stages. A redesign or reduction in lot yield may be necessary to minimise the removal and modification of remnant vegetation. It is recommended that development be located on flat areas or slopes less than 20 degrees, especially where classified vegetation is located downslope to a building, and for development to be away from ridgetops, crests or narrow gullies, as bushfire can spread rapidly in these areas. Circumstances where these locations may be suitable for development to occur include where the land is already cleared, and a BAL rating of BAL 29 or lower can be achieved for the whole development site without the use of an APZ. To ensure soil stability within an APZ, vegetation removal on slopes exceeding 18 degrees is discouraged. The location of plants within an APZ is a key design technique. Guidance has been provided on how combustible objects and landscaping features can be used or located to provide further protection. New information has been provided to describe plant flammability and the key considerations to look at when selecting plants to go within an APZ. There is also a note for local governments to consider developing their own lists of plant species suitable for use within an APZ, accounting for environmental characteristics of the local government area. We have developed a new fact sheet to further explain environmental considerations for bushfire mitigation. This is aimed to clarify vegetation management measures over different land tenure, commentary on DFES's voluntary bushfire risk treatment standards, environmental approvals and exemptions, and other legislative and statutory planning considerations. The fact sheet provides a number of further resources which support changes to Element 2 and Schedule 1, such as reference to the Victorian and Queensland landscaping guidelines. The fact sheet can be found online on the SPP 3.7 webpage under the section Fact Sheets and Guidelines. Changes to the remaining fact sheets listed in this section will occur through the broader policy review. The key aim was to improve the guidance for access requirements in bushfire-prone areas by providing more acceptable solutions which reflect the risk. We have introduced annotations against each of the acceptable solutions to clarify at which planning stage they apply. For example, the requirement for the provision of 2 different roads in 2 different directions is no longer a requirement at the development application stage for single dwellings. We have included additional acceptable solutions and reworded performance principles with extra explanatory notes to assist decision makers and proponents. Importantly, we have revised the acceptable solution for the provision of multiple access routes. It now states that public access should be provided in 2 different directions to 2 suitable destinations. A suitable destination is an area that is not mapped as bushfire prone or is greater than 100 metres from classified vegetation as per Australian standards or AS 3959, and can provide shelter during a bushfire event. For some larger or urbanised coastal communities with one road in, a suitable destination may be identified within the community itself. We've changed reference to cul-de-sac to current terminology of no-through road and included a definition for residential built-out areas. Perimeter roads are an effective design feature to separate hazardous vegetation from development, and this has now been included as an acceptable solution. A perimeter road is required at the strategic planning and subdivision stages, where 10 or more lots are proposed. A perimeter road may not be required, where the adjoining vegetation is classified as grassland, for larger lots including rural living proposals, where all of the lots will have frontage to an existing public road or where it is demonstrated that it can't be provided due to site constraints. A fire service access route should be considered where a perimeter road is not provided. The example on the left proposes a fire service access route between the hazardous vegetation and the development. This is because the new development is already serviced by the existing road, and adding a perimeter road behind them would not be an appropriate planning outcome, as it would result in lost dual road frontage as shown in the example on the right. The acceptable solution for battle axe legs applies at the subdivision stage only. There are no technical requirements where the battle axe leg is less than 50 metres from a public road and the house will be connected to reticulated water. If the battle axe is greater than 50 metres, which is measured from the public road to the effective lot area rather than the dwelling, then the battle axe is required to be 6 metres wide to allow for emergency services vehicles to enter and exit. The commentary within the explanatory notes still outlines that battle axe legs should be avoided if possible. Version 1.4 includes a revised performance principle and acceptable solution for private driveways. The private driveway criteria only applies to development applications, where the distance from the house to the road is less than 70 metres and the house will be connected to reticulated water and the road speed limit is less than 70 kilometres an hour, then it is unlikely that an emergency service vehicle would need to access the property, and therefore there is no requirement for a driveway to be 6 metres wide. The length of the driveway to the proposed house has increased from 50 metres to 70 metres within the acceptable solution. The turnaround area diameter when a building is captured by the private driveway requirements has increased from 17.5 metres diameter to 18 metres. Table 6 has been revised to include perimeter roads and no-through roads as components of public roads in column 1. The 6 metre horizontal clearance distance for public roads has been removed. However, the minimum trafficable width and horizontal clearance figures for emergency access ways, fire service access routes, battle axes and private driveways has remained the same. We have purposely maintained the status quo until we are better informed by the new map of bushfire-prone areas being developed by the CSIRO and the subsequent version 2.0 of the guidelines. The removal of the horizontal clearance distance from Table 6 aligns with the revised acceptable solution for public roads, where the carriageway width should be determined by the decision maker, in accordance with the relevant class of road under the applicable policy or road standard, which could be the Ausroads standards, livable neighbourhoods, or the IPWIA guidelines. It should also be noted that vertical clearance has increased from 4 metres to 4.5 metres. While there is no prescribed width for horizontal clearance, the explanatory notes recommend a traversable verge to allow firefighters to stop and pull over at the side of the road to fight a bushfire without obstructing the entire road. Figure 20 is included in the explanatory notes to illustrate a representation of how horizontal clearance is generally interpreted by land use planners with nominal widths. After significant consultation, Element 4 water has been revised. Feedback from local government highlighted their investment of water supply through provision of strategic water tanks. Their different operational needs and given the size of the state, we realise that a one-size-fits-all approach is unlikely to work across Western Australia. Accordingly, this section has been updated to give more discretion to local governments to determine their water tank needs. The guidelines now outline that tanks could be provided at the subdivision or development application stage, or both. This is further explained in the explanatory notes under the Strategic Water Supplies heading. We recommend that bushfire consultants or proponents check any water requirements proposed in a bushfire management plan with the local government. We have also clarified that when an existing dwelling is included in a proposed subdivision, that the existing dwelling should comply with relevant provisions of Element 4. This might mean that a water tank for the existing house is included as a condition of subdivision approval. Schedule 2 is a new schedule, which outlines technical requirements for any water tank being provided through a planning application. It outlines that above-ground tanks should be constructed out of concrete or steel and which types of fittings to use on tanks. It also includes that the tank may need to comply with the Australian Standard 3500 if the tank is going to be connected to be a domestic water supply. Table 7 outlines the water supply amounts needed for a subdivision or development application in non-reticulated areas. This table should not be used for proposals assessed as vulnerable tourism land uses, as different water supply amounts are listed within Element 5's bushfire protection criteria. Where a structure plan or subdivision proposes to create between 3 to 24 lots, it is optional as to whether each lot is provided with a 10,000 litre water tank or if the subdivision proposes one 50,000 litre strategic water tank instead. It is recommended that the option to install 10,000 litre water tanks on each lot in lieu of a 50,000 litre water tank only occurs when it can be ensured that a development application will be required. If 25 or more lots are proposed, then it is recommended that strategic water tanks be provided. For every additional lot beyond the initial 25 lots, it is at the discretion of the local government whether they require an additional strategic water tank or if each additional lot is provided with a 10,000 litre tank. New guidance is included for when a strategic water tank has been provided at the subdivision stage and a development application is located within the 20-minute turnaround time of that or another strategic water source. If this occurs, then the decision maker could remove the requirement for the provision of an additional water supply at the development application stage. It is important that the local government consider whether the strategic water tank identified has the additional capacity to serve the lot subject to the development application. For grouped dwellings, it is outlined that there could be one 10,000 litre tank per lot or that they could share one 50,000 litre water tank on common property. Extensive additions have been made to Element 4's explanatory notes, including advice on the use of standalone tanks, the need for independent water and power supply, and alternative water sources. Given legislation and Australian standards, it is recommended that drinking water and water for firefighting be separated into different tanks. Even in reticulated areas, there is the possibility that a household can lose its water or power supply, as a fire can damage pipes or pumping equipment. While not mandatory, the guidelines do recommend that households have an independent water and power supply. We have outlined that in some instances that a dam, river or other water source could be considered in an application if it complies with DEFIS's GL06 standard and is accepted by the local government. Section 5.5.1 and 5.5.2 in the body of the guidelines have been reviewed to reflect the commentary contained within the position statement for tourism land uses in bushfire-prone areas. Further clarification is now included in the preambles that risk assessments should only be prepared for tourism proposals involving large numbers of people. This may include caravan parks, resorts, hotels, motels, breweries, etc. Holiday homes, bed and breakfasts and small-scale tourism proposals are not required to undertake a risk assessment. There is a new Element 5 and the performance principles and acceptable solutions that form the bushfire protection criteria for this element have been revised from what was included in the position statement. In recognition of the different characteristics of remote camping grounds, these now form a separate category. Day uses which don't involve overnight accommodation are also a separate category. Bed and breakfast and holiday homes have been divided into two categories with different acceptable solutions depending on if they are within a residential built-out area or outside of a residential built-out area. The requirement for a risk assessment for a bed and breakfast, along with holiday homes, has been removed as this was considered too onerous for this scale of development. The requirement to retrofit existing dwellings to a bushfire construction standard has also been removed, as this is unreasonably expensive and legally difficult to enforce. The distinction between an existing dwelling and one yet to be constructed has been removed as the same outcome should be achieved. For bed and breakfasts and holiday homes within a residential built-out area, an APZ in accordance with Element 2, Siting and Design of Development, should be provided. There is now no requirement for two access routes to two different destinations, and there is now additional guidance on the provision of private driveways and passing bays. For bed and breakfast and holiday homes outside of residential built-out areas, public road access in two different directions should be provided, except where the access leads to a suitable destination and leads away from the source of the hazard. Revised acceptable solutions for short-stay accommodation and remote caravan and camping grounds have been included. These include some changes to the requirements for no-through roads to be 200 metres. Some scenarios where on-site shelter can be provided as an acceptable solution and the provision of water supply for firefighting purposes has been changed to reflect the revised amounts in Element 4. For short-term accommodation, remote camping and day uses, the maximum length of no-through roads is now based on the roadside vegetation, excluding the road reserve and the subsequent bushfire hazard level. The length of a no-through road decreases with an increasing bushfire hazard level. For example, an extreme BHL means that a no-through road should be no more than 200 metres length, but for a low BHL, there is no limitation on the road length. Where vehicular access cannot be achieved, shelter on site can now be provided as an acceptable solution to address this in some instances. Where development proposes a maximum of 100 persons, a shelter can be provided as an acceptable solution. For proposals which involve more than 100 persons at any one time and access cannot be achieved, a performance principle is required to demonstrate that the risk can be mitigated through the use of an on-site shelter. The requirements for the provision of an on-site shelter have not been changed from what was included in the position statement for tourism land uses in bushfire-prone areas. The guidelines stress that where on-site shelters are being proposed, that support of the local government is important, as the local government will be responsible for overseeing the conditions of the development approval for the ongoing management and auditing of the on-site shelter. It is recommended that the local governments speak to their local emergency management committee prior to approval. Day uses include art galleries, breweries, exhibition centres, hotels, reception centres, restaurants, cafes, small bars, taverns and wineries. Not all tourism day uses are vulnerable land uses. Vulnerability should be determined on a case-by-case basis by the decision maker with consideration of whether there will be evacuation challenges in the event of a bushfire, whether the number of visitors and staff on site at any one time will present evacuation challenges, and whether the visitors are likely to be tourists who are unfamiliar with the area or visitors from the local area. There is some flexibility provided for the requirement for two-way access. It is dependent on management of the site, closure of days of elevated FDI, and non-operation during the bushfire season. Currently, Clause 6.6.1 of SPP 3.7 requires vulnerable land uses, high-risk land uses and unavoidable development to be accompanied by a bushfire management plan that is jointly endorsed by the relevant local government and DFES. However, what currently occurs is DFES will review bushfire management plans and provide referral advice for decision makers to consider, and decision makers endorse the bushfire management plan when they provide planning approval. DFES advise that endorsement is the role of the decision maker. The amended text within the guidelines provides clarity regarding the endorsement of bushfire management plans, and reference in the SPP will be updated through the Bushfire Framework Review. The changes are effective immediately. All planning proposals and applications where SPP 3.7 applies should be assessed against the updated criteria within the guidelines. We acknowledge that it takes time to prepare a bushfire management plan, and some may have been undertaken some time prior to the submission of a planning proposal. Decision makers are advised to continue to accept bushfire management plans that align with the previous version of the guidelines for 3 months until the 13th of March 2022. For any bushfire management plan received from the 13th of March 2022, it is expected that the requirements of the new guidelines will be used. The planning bulletin and position statement for tourism land uses in bushfire-prone areas will be rescinded, and version 1.3 will become inactive from the 13th of March 2022. We hope you have enjoyed today's presentation. If you have any questions, please email the Land Use Planning Policy team, bushfire@dplh.wa.gov.au.